Great. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our Q&A session on the INEE Measurement Library call for submissions. We wanted to give folks an opportunity to ask questions they may have about their first call for submission process. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I'm the Knowledge Management Coordinator at INEE. And I serve as our coordinator for the Measurement Library. And I will let Abby, Roxanne, and Marlana, do you want to quickly introduce yourselves?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Marlana. I am the education researcher at the IRC. Happy to have you here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Roxanne Kairos. I'm a research scientist with New York University's Global TIES for Children. Very nice to have everyone here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abhirami Shankar, and I'm a research coordinator at NYU Global TIES for Children.
Thanks all. And a few kind of housekeeping things. We are recording this session, so folks can watch it afterwards if they aren't able to make it. If you have any additional questions than the ones that have already been asked, feel free to use the Q&A function or write it in the chat, and we will try to respond during this session. So with that, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the INEE Measurement Library, and then we'll jump in to our questions. The Measurement Library was launched in 2019 through a consortium with International Rescue Committee and NYU Global TIES for Children, along with INEE. And the Measurement Library is a collection of measurement tools to assess children's learning and holistic development and service provider quality in crisis contexts. The tools are meant to help education practitioners generate high quality data to inform program planning and review. And those are the types of measures that we're looking for in the submission process, and Roxanne will elaborate a little further on that. So we'll jump into our questions now. And our first one, Roxanne, is for you. And it's if you could go over why this process for submitting materials, why are we asking for the measures to have evidence? Why are we looking for this level of rigor in our measures?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, for that question. So when we first started doing this work about 4 years ago now, we had been in partnership with the International Rescue Committee doing research, particularly with Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and found that there just were not a lot of measurement tools for the type of research that we were doing that had been tested in the context that we were working in. And that really limits our ability to generate meaningful evidence about the communities that we're trying to understand better. And so we started doing some work to try to identify some additional measures, which we have done some of. There's actually an inventory of tools in the measurement library as well that addresses some of this. And then we worked with different research practice policy partnerships to actually develop and test these types of measurement tools. But one of the things that's really important for us, and part of the reason that there is kind of a high bar for submitting to the measurement library, is we want to give folks some level of confidence in terms of whether or not these tools will work in the context that they're working in. So if you've had a chance to take a look at the submission process, or if not, you'll see that we ask for the measurement tool itself, an evidence report that describes any of the kind of psychometric analyses that you've done of the measurement tool, to give us more information on reliability and validity, and the training materials as well. And all of those pieces of information help our team to review them and make some recommendations about how confident folks can be using those measurement tools in their own context.
Thanks, Roxanne. And our next question is also for you, but what kind of tools can be submitted for to the measurement library? For example, EGRA and EGMA, do they have to be modified to be considered eligible, or would the standard of each of those tools be eligible?
Sure. So I think the first thing that we want to take into consideration is that if you're testing or adapting in any way a tool that already exists, that you are taking into consideration whatever their kind of IP regulations are. If it's an open source tool, then I think it's definitely something that's welcome to be added to the measurement library. I'm pretty sure that EGRA and EGMA are open source as they are already, so it's definitely something that you could submit to the measurement library. What's really valuable about these types of tools that have been tested in a lot of different contexts is, say, we used EGRA and EGMA with Syrian refugees in Lebanon, and you've used it maybe in Tanzania or in Iraq. The more evidence that we have on how this tool is functioning in these different contexts, the more available resources will be for other folks, so that they can look at maybe what version of the EGRA, what translation you used in the context you were working in, and find something that is a closer fit for the context that they want to use it in. So definitely really open in terms of what types of tools can be submitted. As Sarah was explaining earlier on, it can be things about kind of child outcomes, but also about the program itself. Observation tools, we're still trying to figure out the best way to include more game-based types of assessments, because those are not necessarily like a PDF or an Excel document that can be submitted. But the main thing is that there are no restrictions from the original developers in how things are shared. So for example, the strengths and difficulties questionnaire does have some copyright issues, so that would be something that we wouldn't necessarily be able to add the tool in, but we can add a link to the tool and kind of the evidence report and the training materials to the library. But if it is an open source tool to begin with and you test it in your context, then that's totally great to submit.
Thanks. Our next question is for Abhi. If you could provide a brief overview of the submission process and potentially some guidance on how to use Submittable, which is the program we're using to accept submissions.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks for popping the link in the chat box. I can share my screen and walk through the call for submissions web page and the Submittable form. Okay. So the call for submissions web page can be accessed through the measurement library homepage. And it really is an outline of most, if not all, of the information that is going to be important for you in order to submit your tool for inclusion in the library. If you click right there, that'll take you to Submittable, which we'll get to in a minute. So in terms of materials that you're going to need in order to submit, there are three main things, which is a PDF, Word, or Excel document of the measurement tool itself, the training materials, and an evidence report. Linked here is a template for an evidence report. And while your evidence report doesn't have to be organized in the same way or look like this, we have flagged which components are required, recommended, and optional. And in order to meet the minimum criteria, all of the required components are going to need to be in your evidence report. So we've also included a submissions process and timeline section, along with criteria for the measure itself and training materials. So the criteria for the measure itself, linked here is the psychometric rubric that reviewers are going to be evaluating your tool against. So there is a summary of the different types of validity and reliability that are fit for different purposes. As Roxanne mentioned, to meet the minimum criteria, the evidence report is going to have to report on at least one type of reliability and one type of validity that's fit for purpose. And down here, we have some of the questions that reviewers are going to be looking for the answers of in your evidence report. We've also linked here the criteria for training materials. Similarly, the questions that your the reviewers are going to be looking to answer with the materials that you submit. On to Submittable. So this is submittable. It starts off with just general information about your measurement tool. And as I mentioned, in order to continue and complete the application, you are going to need to have reviewed the submission criteria on the call for submissions webpage and upload soft copies of the measurement tool, training materials, and evidence reports. From there on, it's information about constructs and purpose, sample demographics, administration details, and measurement tool design. All in all, it should take you between 30 minutes to an hour to complete, is my best guess. And yeah, that is submittable.
Thanks, Roxanne. Sorry, Abby. Roxanne, this question is for you. If you could walk through a little bit more detail the vetting criteria for measures that Abby was speaking to.
Sure. And just one quick thing to add on submittable. Once you create an account, it is something where you can kind of start filling it out. And if you need to go back and get additional information or identify the files, you can work on the application over time. So it's okay if not everything is in there at once, but we do ask that you fill out the entire form before you submit it to us, because once it's submitted, then there'll be a review process that gets started from that point forward. So it's best that we have all of the information. Okay, so let me just pull up what Abby was sharing, and I can share my screen. Okay, so I think Abby gave kind of a good overview, and this is something that folks should spend a little bit of time looking at a little bit more closely. But we know that there's different measurement tools for different purposes. The way that we've broken it out here, and there should be some in the FAQs for the measurement library, additional description of these different purposes. Is formative. So these are a lot of tools that teachers are using in the classroom to understand how kids are doing, to kind of improve their practices and things like that. Screening has one of the highest bars because these are often used for making higher stakes decisions, mental health measures, things like that. Program evaluation, so a lot of times used for research, understanding if kids' learning outcomes have changed, things like that. Program monitoring, also at the level of trying to understand how the program is functioning and things like that. And then national monitoring, so thinking about things kind of at the scale of like the PISA or TIMS are national monitoring tools. And based on kind of the best evidence that we have so far in psychometric science and the way that we're thinking about these, we identified the types of evidence that we are going to be looking for in your evidence report based on the purpose. So the way that you would read this is that for formative assessment, we would be really interested in, at minimum, seeing information on content validity, construct validity, internal consistency, reliability, and inter-rater reliability for that type of scale. For screening, this one, because it's much higher stakes, we'd be looking for evidence kind of in all of these areas. So that's what we're looking for here. And we will, we have kind of a template that we've developed. We have a reference group of psychometric experts who will be reviewing the evidence report that you submit, and they will be looking for these different pieces of information throughout. Some of this you'll actually include in that submission form, so it's a little bit easier for us to find it. But there's nothing here that if you've written up the methods of how you've done any measurement research, there's nothing kind of new or more complicated. We tried to simplify it as much as possible. And using that information, we will give kind of our recommendation on what level we think the measurement tool should be considered at. So if there's not very strong evidence for the measurement tool. We still think it's valuable to include it, but we probably won't include the measurement tool itself. We will say that it's under development, it's a seedling, and if folks are interested, they can reach out to the developer directly and talk about the measurement tool. We found that a lot of observation tools are just really challenging to develop, but it can often be really beneficial to know what somebody else has done and to build from that. The second level is proceed for purpose with caution and revision. So this means that there's pretty strong evidence. We feel pretty good about where the measure is at, but we have some concerns about it being used more broadly. So we would include some recommendations around what type of revisions we would recommend based on the evidence that's there. And then for measurement tools that have really strong evidence, we would recommend that it's ready for purpose with adaptation for context. So if the user is not using it in the exact same context, we'd say you might want to consider adapting it for the context you're using it in. This is the kind of review that we're giving, and we're hoping that this is not punitive to the developers, but it's more informative to the users so that they know what level of confidence they should have in using the measurement tool. So I will stop there.
Thanks. And next question is about the evidence report. If you could walk through kind of that template and the requirements we're asking for that.
Sure. I can give a little bit more in depth to what Abby was saying. Let's see if I can zoom this in a little bit more. So the evidence report template is, we have currently in the measurement library technical working papers with all of the tools that are in there. Those are quite a bit more extensive than what we're looking for in these evidence reports, because the consortium members who we supported to do the measure development had a lot of additional support and a bit of funding to build those out. So this is kind of the streamlined version of what we're looking for. If you have already published a paper that is an open source paper that has all of this information in it, that the publishers are okay with you sharing, that is something that's okay. If it's not an open source paper, if they're not okay with you sharing it, we would ask that you create kind of this abbreviated evidence report to include in the measurement library. We want to make sure that everything in the library is open source and available for public use. Okay, so like Abby was saying, there's indication of what is required, which are the red checks, what are recommended components, which is the purple asterisks, and what is an optional component, which is the blue line there. So we have it broken out kind of by section. There's the cover page, title, author, abstract are all required. Recommended are an overview of the skills, outcomes, or constructs being assessed, an overview of the measure evidence base. So if you've done kind of some prior research, if you have built this off of other theories and things like that, that's what would be included there. Adaptation, development, and assembly. So if you've done some adaptation of the measurement tool, a description of that. In the methods section, what is required is the context. So giving us some information, was this tested with refugees or with internally displaced persons or with the local population? What was the sample size? Did the sample vary? Were there kind of different treatment groups? And what was the procedure? So some description of how the data was collected and all of these types of things. It's really important to know also the format of the data collection. And then optional is the data and analytic plan. So what you had planned for the analysis. An overview of the descriptives is also optional. And then required in the results section is validity and reliability and as Abby mentioned, we're looking for at least one form of validity and one form of reliability. If you did more analysis on these, then definitely include them. It's really helpful information. For those of you who have looked for a measurement tool before, I'm sure that you've looked for this type of information. For your context, I know sometimes I look for a measurement tool and there's the reliability, but it's the reliability for when the tool was tested somewhere in middle America with a population that's not relevant to the population that I'm working with. And it gives me some level of confidence that the tool seemed to be functioning, but very little information about how the tool would work in the context that I'm using it in. So this is really valuable information, I think, for others who are interested in using the measurement tool. Optional are if you've done other psychometric analyses, for example, measurement and variance testing. Does the measure vary between genders or between different populations? Sensitivity and specificity, particularly for screening measures. Item functioning, you can include those if you've done them, but they're not required. And then in the discussion, we have the summary of results and limitations, which are required, and recommendations for revision or use. This is incredibly helpful, especially if you feel like you're still developing the measurement tool and there's things that you're planning on changing. The evidence report should reflect how you use the measurement tool in that context and that particular evidence. But if you are planning on making changes and testing it again, this would be a really good place to include that information so that others who are trying to test it kind of gain from your experience and your thinking in that section. And then in the appendices, the main thing that we're interested in having are the references. We're also interested in the technical appendices if you feel comfortable including those. One of the things that we've noted with other contributors to the measurement library is there's sometimes a concern if they're planning on submitting an academic publication that if there's too much information in this evidence report, then it might create some conflict with submitting those publications. So we do encourage you to leave out any of these things that are concerning for you and just focus on the pieces of information that would be helpful for somebody else using the measurement tool if you are concerned about kind of any double dipping publication issues that might come up. So that's a general overview, and this is all available to you to review as well. And we have an email address for the measurement library if you have additional questions after you've looked through them.
Thanks, Roxanne. That was really helpful. Just to note, we are coming up on the half-hour mark. So if you have any burning questions you would like to ask, please note in the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to those before we end. I will now go over quickly the training materials rubric, which is also available from the call for submissions page. And the goal of the training materials that we're asking for is because we want to ensure that the measures are being used in the way you've intended to, and to provide guidance for enumerators and users onto how to use the measure. And so that's really what we're looking for in our training materials. And this rubric provides guidance on within that training materials what we're looking for. We ask that there's a brief summary, just in case training materials are shared outside of evidence report, so that the user or the reader knows what the measure is. Then we're looking for how to use the training materials. Is it via an in-person training? Is it an online module? What are the requirements, the time that's needed, and what level of expertise is required for this training? The next section is about the language, the training, and the enumerator. Is the guidance around the measure and how to use it clear within the training materials, because that is really the heart of what these training materials are for. Does it include clear objectives in sessions if there are multiple sessions? Is it clear who the enumerator should be within these training materials? Could the session be facilitated by a non-technical expert? Those are the types of questions that we're looking for to be answered within the training materials. And then around context and adaptation. So is there guidance on how to adapt your materials, for example, images, names, scenarios, things like that? And then what are required to to provide these trainings, or the alternatives if it is a high-tech requirement. So all of these questions, and they're more guiding questions, are listed on the call for submissions webpage. And again, as Roxanne said, if you have additional questions, you can email us through the email I will put in the chat right now. And the last thing I will note is really around the timeline of the submission process. All submissions will be reviewed by 4 members of the Measurement Library Reference Group. And that is a group made up of kind of practitioners and psychometric experts. And we will have 2 members of the reference group review the measure and the evidence material, and then 2 reference group members reviewing the training materials. And all of that process will take a couple months to do. So the moment you submit your measure, you'll receive an email confirming your submission. And we will be doing a general overview to ensure that all the basic requirements are met. And then at that point, the review will begin by the reference group measures. You'll be notified via email the status of your submission between 2 to 3 months through Submittable. And then once that happens, we'll be uploading to the measurement library within 1 to 2 months of notification of approval. And again, some of these timelines are a little bit flexible. If you have any questions or concerns about this timeline, feel free to reach out to us at any moment. And just to note that the call for submissions is now open through December 10th. We know that it can take time to gather all of these materials. If you're finishing your research, that can take time. So we've left it open till December 10th, and you can submit your materials at any time during that. So with that, if there aren't any other questions shared, which I don't see, I would like to thank everyone for joining us for this quick session, and to all of our panelists for joining, particularly Abby and Roxanne for helping answer some of these questions. And we look forward to reading your submissions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.